Good evening, everyone. I'm certainly glad you're here tonight and welcome to this month's All Hands meeting. Again, my name is Jim Lawrence, the board chair. I want to thank all of you for taking time out to be with us tonight. Your dedication, energy, and commitment to our shared vision makes all the difference as we work together to build a more just, accountable, and transparent San Mateo County. For those of you who are new, Fixing San Mateo County is a coalition of community members, advocates, and stakeholders dedicated to advancing effective and fair governance in our county. We're also a member of a statewide organization called CCSO, which you'll hear about a little later. And specifically through law enforcement oversight, public safety reform, and community-driven solutions, that's our focus. We believe that by working together, we can create policies that reflect our shared values of accountability, fairness, and justice for all residents. Tonight, we have a very special guest with us, and I'm truly honored to have her share some thoughts with us. So without further ado, I'll pass the microphone over to Mr. Jerry Threet, who's also a member of CCSO, and let him give us a few words about her. Jerry.
Good evening. Glad to be here with you and excited to hear this speaker. Before we get to our speaker, I just want to take a moment to say a couple of words about our other co-host, CLEAN and CCSO. CLEAN, our Community for Law Enforcement Accountability Now, is a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to support meaningful civilian oversight, transparency, and accountability of law enforcement in Sonoma County. CLEAN partners with the Sonoma County chapter of the NAACP and the California Coalition for Sheriff Oversight, and has also worked closely with the Northern California ACLU, the League of Women Voters, and other groups and organizations to increase fairness, access, and equity for all people of Sonoma County and interacting with law enforcement. So CCSO, as we've both mentioned a couple of times, is a statewide coalition that advocates for and supports establishing, maintaining, and improving effective civilian oversight of county sheriff's offices to bring accountability and transparency throughout California as authorized under California Assembly Bill 1185. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to introducing our tonight's guest, Jessica Pishko. Jessica Pishko is an independent journalist and lawyer who has been writing about the criminal legal system for a decade or more, with a focus on the political power of law enforcement officials, largely unfettered. She has been awarded journalism fellowships from the Pulitzer Center and Type Investigations, and has a 2022 New America Fellowship. A longtime Texas resident, she currently lives with her family in North Carolina. Since 2018, Jessica has focused on American sheriffs and their role, past and present, in perpetuating mass incarceration and white supremacy, as well as how sheriffs present a growing threat to democracy in this country. In addition to her newsletter, Posse Comitatus, her writings have been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Politico, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, The Appeal, Slate, and Democracy Docket. And that is a list of today's independent journalism, as we see so many of our publications going a different direction.
Right.
Her most recent book is The Highest Law in the Land, How the Unchecked Power of Sheriffs Threatens Democracy, published in September of 2024. I just want to say I read Jessica's blog regularly and recommend it quite highly, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to our esteemed guest, Jessica Pishko.
Thank you, Jerry. Also, thank you for, I did not realize I had a frequent blog reader, so I really appreciate it. You know, I want to start off by saying thank you so much to the people who set this up. Thank you to all of the community organizers for everything you do. I know that it's hard work. One of the challenges of working on sheriffs, of course, is that it's a very local job. It's a county position. And so it's really the local county organizers who do most of the hard work. So thank you guys. And thank you all for joining me. I want to take a minute and acknowledge it's kind of a difficult time right now. I know we're all, I think, a little bit overwhelmed with news. A lot is changing very quickly. And so I hope, one of the things I try to do is the best I can is to bring clarity as best I can at this moment. And I'll here acknowledge, particularly with respect to immigration, that things are changing very, very fast. And so I feel like as soon as I say something, it's a little bit outdated. In any event, so just to talk a little bit about the highest law in the land, I used to live in San Francisco, and actually the origin of the book is in California. As you guys know, when California had to reduce its prison population because the Supreme Court ordered it, one of the things they did was this process called realignment. And what realignment did was send lots of people back to county jails. So the essence of the plan was that in order to reduce the prison population, California thought that what it would do is have more people housed in county jails in lieu of prison. Most of those were people serving around a year. It's about a year and under. And I, was reporting on this process of realignment. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was that I noticed that every county was doing something very, very different. So one of the things realignment did was give counties grants, but did not instruct them how to use that grant money. And so what I began to see was that in different counties, sheriffs who were now in charge of the jail and what to do, right, with sort of an increased number of people that might be in their jails, they were doing wildly different things. So some people were doing a process called split sentencing, which was kind of, you spend part of your, maybe you might have a sentence, you might spend part of it in jail and you might spend part of it not in jail. They were sending some people home, right, reducing sentences, but then some counties were simply building larger jails and putting more people in those jails. And I think one of the things that happened rather expectedly was that a lot of these jails got very, very dangerous. And what I noticed was that the sheriffs in many of these counties were not very willing to talk about what they could do to make these jails safer, right? They mostly attributed a lot of the violence to, the people that they were getting into the jail. They argued that because these were people who maybe should be in state prison, that some of these people might be more inclined to commit violence, and that's why the jails were more dangerous. Sometimes they blamed people who had, suffered from drug addiction, or they blamed people bringing drugs into the jail. They sort of did everything but talk about, right, how they might actually manage the situation. And so, that started me on the process of thinking about county sheriffs and why it was that they were able to make these decisions without a lot of oversight, and not a whole lot of direction for the state. And of course, you guys know now, right? We know that sheriffs are elected in every county in California. They are elected in almost every county in the United States. So almost every state has sheriffs, with the exception of Rhode Island and Connecticut, Hawaii, and Alaska. Hawaii and Alaska just don't have counties, so they don't have county sheriffs. And almost all of these sheriffs across the country are all democratically elected within their county. One of the things I do like to point out is that every county gets one sheriff, whether it's a big county, right? So you could have a few million people, which some counties do. You could have in some counties in Texas, right? There's one county with 250 people. They also get one sheriff, right? So every county gets one sheriff, no matter how large or how small, how populous or not. And the most important thing about sheriffs, in my view, is that they have two kind of major roles, right? They are the law enforcement for the county. That's sort of the one that I think most people understand. And that usually means they can make traffic stops, investigate crimes, do most of the things police do, and this is true in most places, right? There's a few exceptions here and there. But the second thing sheriffs do that is also very important is that they run county jails. Now in California, every county jail is run by a sheriff. I just thought that through to make sure that was right. I'm pretty sure that's correct. About 85% of the jails in the United States are run by county sheriffs, so it's the vast majority of jails. And what I think that does is, one, it gives sheriffs quite a lot of power, at least in terms of how much money they receive, and also just how much of the criminal justice system they control, right? Particularly on this really local level. And I think it starts to point to why we have so many problems in this particular area. I point out the jails really because I think it's always worth pointing out that, you know, there's been a lot of prison reform in the country and in California, right? Indeed, state prisons have reduced violence. I think, they have tried, the state of California has closed state prisons, right? They've tried, so they've reduced some of that. But we know that county jails remain very dangerous. We also know that more people are dying in county jails than they were a few years ago, right? So this is a problem that is continuing to rise, even though we might say that in a lot of places people have put into place different mechanisms, right? You might say people maybe know better, right? They've learned lessons, they have ideas on how to reduce populations and keep people safe, but these county jails have simply not kept people safe. And this is a big problem even in a place like California, right? This is a red state and a blue state problem. It's not one of the most interesting things about jail deaths and police violence is it's not a Democrat or a Republican problem. It's an everybody problem. All the sheriffs in California have problems with jail deaths, no matter what their political party is. And so I think that that's something that, well, in my view, it's something we should take very seriously. And it also points to like the underlying issues of why are sheriffs running jails and what are some of the problems with having one entity doing policing and jailing and being asked to respond to all sorts of things. I think, in rural areas, many people know that sheriffs tend to have a lot more power. Now, the other interesting thing that has been coming up is that some of you may be aware that police shootings, right? So sort of the shooting of sometimes armed, sometimes unarmed people on the street, those are also continuing to go up. Has not gone down. And the latest data from the last 2 years actually indicates that most of these shootings are being done by sheriffs, and a lot of them are being done in rural areas. So what we see across the country is that even though, again, to point out, like I think a lot of people and a lot of groups have been working on police reform for some time, implementing various things, oversight, body cameras, rules about use of force, that those reforms have simply not necessarily trickled down to sheriff's offices, and that what we now see has become more obvious, which is that sheriffs and their deputies are more violent, and that a lot of this violence is happening in more rural areas. There's a question about whether or not it's linked to oversight and why, which is something I'm actually kind of interested in looking into, but it's pointing to the fact that this is still true, right? So we know that this is something that's still a big problem. And just to kind of, I think, pinpoint one other important thing about sheriffs generally, well, I'll point to a few other things. I think, right now, sheriffs are getting a particular amount of attention because of their role in immigration. Was to talk about that because that is something that is coming up a lot. And this points to the reason why it's a danger to have sheriffs who are kind of have their fingers in different pieces of the criminal legal system, right? Because sheriffs are doing both policing and jailing, they are very important partners in mass deportation. And the reason for that is because if someone is arrested, first of all, we know where they are, right? They're in jail so that you don't have to look for them. And second of all, if someone is arrested, law enforcement is allowed to run they basically do something like a background check, right? So they run your fingerprints, they ask you if you're a US citizen, they can get all sorts of data on you. And once that happens, right, once that arrest happens and you are booked into jail, even if you are later released, so you could be, for example, released with no charges filed, you might get cited, you might get released pending your trial, right? Jails, a lot of people are going in and out of jail. Most of them are not being charged with, I think, what we would call like serious or violent crimes, right? The vast majority are people kind of going in and out. But all of those people, right, are getting their biometric information traced. And as a result, it's relatively easy for federal agencies like ICE to see if any of those people being arrested might be potentially deportable. And then that information, because of the way we have our system set up in this country, because of a system called secure communities, that's that really makes it easy, right? It makes it relatively easy for ICE to find people who might be deportable once they're arrested, and then it is relatively easy for them to go pick those people up because they also know where they are. And so that's, I think, points to the other thing. And then the last thing I'll point to, and then we can get to questions because I sort of see them filing in, and some of them are things I would legitimately talk about anyway, is that, one of the issues with sheriffs, and I'm sure you guys see this in California and in fact in every state, is that sheriffs are also very persuasive lobbyists. So California, like all states, has a state sheriff association, and like all state associations, they lobby on behalf of their members. There's also a national sheriff's association that lobbies on behalf of sheriffs everywhere. They lobby in Washington, D.C., and the National Sheriff's Association is really the organization that is doing the bulk of the lobbying with Tom Homan and DHS and ICE, right? That's really the entity that's doing that. They're the ones who are influencing or attempting to influence changes to immigration law. But the state Sheriff's Association plays a big role in commenting on and opposing local laws. So this was a few years ago. There was, I think there was an idea to separate the office of sheriff and coroner. So in some counties in California, there are what are called sheriff coroners. So it's an elected sheriff also serves as the county coroner. And there was the idea to pass a bill to change this, which makes some sense. But a lot of the sheriffs lobbied against it, right? They asked basically the sheriffs in different counties asked their assembly people and representatives that not to vote for this. They didn't want to see it go to committee. And then my understanding is the bill sort of died and didn't get to committee. So I think that that's like a really, important thing to know in terms of their political power. And, because sheriffs, you get one sheriff for every county, no matter how big or small, one of the things that happens in a state, so I right now live in North Carolina, so we have about 100 counties, so about 100 sheriffs. Only really about 5 or 6 of those counties have something like 2/3 of the population of the state. And this is true in a lot of places, right? So we have 5 or 6 counties that have 2/3 of the people in the state. That's also where most of the people of color live. It's also where most of the immigrants live. And so, but when they lobby at the state, they could get, let's say they got 80 sheriffs to show up at the state legislature and lobby. It looks like a lot of sheriffs, but what people don't realize is those 80 sheriffs are far from representing the majority of people in the state, right? They're representing actually a minority of people living in the state. And so as a result, it's something like the Electoral College, right? It's creating an impression that there's like a great deal of representation, and sheriffs will point out that they are elected, of course, and we could talk a little bit about the problems with sheriff elections, but it creates an impression that it's a more democratic office than some other offices, but in fact, it kind of acts as like a disproportionate measure, right? So same thing kind of on the national level, right? There's a little over 3,000 sheriffs in the country, but something like 80% of those sheriffs have about 20% of the population, and then vice versa, right? About 20% of sheriffs are sheriffs of counties with about 80% of the population. So you have like a big skew in terms of how many sheriffs to how many people. So it could look like a lot of people agree with something when it's not really people, it's really just sheriffs in counties. And I am now going to turn to the questions because I see you guys have a lot of questions, and I see someone talk. I saw the first question. Do you want
So
to, Jerry? I
I've
see the
been,
first question about elections, so I was going to go right into that since it's pretty relevant.
yeah, I think that's a good one to start with. So I'll just read the question
Mhm.
so everyone that hasn't read it can know what it is. So given what you found with regard to some elected sheriffs feeling they're above the law, do you think sheriffs should be appointed by county elected bodies, similar to how police chiefs are appointed, rather than independently elected?
So I don't really have a strong opinion on it, but I could talk a little bit about the differences. So one of the things that you pointed out is that police chiefs are appointed, right? And the way it works when you look for a police chief, and you guys might be very, very familiar, is that it's sort of a nationwide search, right? And police chiefs move from city to city. So it might be like the police chief of Oakland might become the police chief of Dallas, might become the police chief of Baltimore. And many times police chiefs go from like smaller cities to bigger cities. When cities are looking for police chiefs, they'll right? They do a wide search, recruit from all over. And similarly, police chiefs are hired by the mayor or city council, and then they can get fired by the city council or mayor, which usually happens pretty quickly if there's some sort of major scandal. So it's done pretty fast. And we know that the turnover for police chiefs is much more frequent than the turnover for sheriffs, even though sheriffs are elected. And sheriffs are elected for 4-year terms, just to point that out. Now I know California just passed a law changing the way the year time when sheriffs were elected, because it used to be staggered and now they're trying to align it. One of the problems with sheriff elections tends to be that they're off year. And so people are not always paying attention to elections. This is a problem, of course, with a lot of local elections. Local elections are not always on the right year. Also, a lot of local elections are determined at the primary level, so it's not the voting day, right? It's the primary. And so sometimes that also is like, it can be hard to get people to turn out for the primary because they may not realize that that's the important election. So I do think there's like just a lot of confusion in people's minds of like, when are they supposed to vote and who are they voting for? But that's true for many, many things. So one of the reasons why these elections are not particularly competitive tends to be that because sheriffs have a lot of discretion over who they elevate in their office and who they don't, they often will elevate people that agree with them. And while in California, they cannot hire and fire at will because California does have deputy unions, so they cannot just fire people. They will sort of demote people that they would prefer not to have in power, right? So the sheriff will sort of say this, they'll decide this is the person that I want to take over, and they'll elevate them and let them rise through the ranks so that they can be prepared to take over. And this sort of allows them to like continue a line. The other thing in California is because deputy unions are extremely powerful, the deputy unions play a really big role in picking who the sheriff is. So I have seen that what seems to tend to happen is that the deputy union will, right, the person the deputy union supports is usually the person who gets elected sheriff. This makes some sense because the deputies are highly invested in who's the sheriff. On the flip side, the deputies are highly invested in a sheriff who will do things like spend more money, particularly buying them stuff like uniforms or cars, or right. So they'll buy new things for the deputies. So this is also like it's not necessarily picking the sheriff for the reasons that people involved in the justice system would pick the sheriff, right? Maybe not policy, but they're probably picking them because of what they believe they'll get in return. So it creates like kind of a mixed incentive, right? Like a very powerful deputy union will support a sheriff, maybe not because of like good policies that people want, but because of like various other promises. I don't really have I mean, the only one of the few things we can say, there are not a lot of appointed sheriffs in the country, so it's very hard to do any kind of direct comparison and contrast. The little information we have suggests that the advantage to an appointed official is that they spend less money. It seems like elected sheriffs seem to spend more money, particularly in election years, and that appointed sheriffs seem to spend less money. The one place that has currently an appointed sheriff is Pierce County, Washington, which is where Seattle is. They switched from elected to an appointed sheriff. So they actually recently went through an initiative to decide whether to switch it back to elective, and they ended up keeping it appointed. But that was one of the reasons why. Now sheriffs are extremely invested in having their office elected. All of the sheriff associations oppose having appointed sheriffs, and they really see it as like a diminishment of their power. This is like a really important thing for sheriffs and something that they use to justify a lot of what they do, because they'll say, well, I was elected. I mean, in a way, right, it's not unlike what we hear now from the president, right? Like, I was elected and therefore I have a mandate to do XYZ because that's what the people want. And that's sort of how they see their job and justify what they do.
So one of the things that is questions that's come up in relation to this is when sheriffs, for example, commit misconduct themselves, sometimes, committing corrupt acts and things like that. And so the questions are about what are good ways to deal with that. For example, removal of sheriffs, or sometimes I think it's in California, it's called official misconduct, and there's a process, very cumbersome process that can happen that way. But there are also, sometimes local counties have their own processes that they adopt through their charters to remove. So folks are wondering what you might think about those types of abilities to remove a sheriff.
I think that, well, one of the things we do know is that sheriffs don't get removed a lot. And because sheriffs don't get removed a lot, what tends to happen is that a lot people, right? So both people in the community, but also like other local politicians don't really know how the removal process works. And it's just true. Like, there are, if you look at how many sheriffs have been removed, it's just a very, very small number. Even if and this is if you're looking at, over the past like 150 years. So it's just like a small number of sheriffs. And so what happens is, if a sheriff hasn't been removed since like the 1930s, local politicians are sort of unsure like how the process works. The process that maybe doesn't feel modern, or does it speak to like modern concerns. And most of these processes, as you point out, Jerry, are related to some kind of official misconduct. So, I mean, around the country, there's kind of like a few basic processes. Like, one is a sort of official misconduct process that requires a kind of finding that there was like that something was done that violates what they would term the oath of office. So it has to be like a certain category of thing happened, right? And like I said, these are the most common categories of these. Again, our references are very old, so it's just like old. So a lot of them were like sheriffs who were running like gambling dens or something, or they were bootleggers. So they would say, like, the sheriffs say, oh well, we have to remove this sheriff because he's like running the local gambling establishment, and that sheriff's not supposed to be doing that. And again, like I said, it points to like just how old the cases are. Like, it's not very modern. The second way is kind of like a popular recalls, which California, right? You get like a certain number of signatures, and then you put it on the ballot, and people can vote like yay or nay. Do we want to recall this sheriff? And California actually has like an easier recall process than some other states. And some states don't even have that. And then some states kind of have like a combination method, which is like you have to have both like a good reason to remove the sheriff, and then you can do a recall. So like, that's kind of how it works. Now, because most of these removal mechanisms rely upon like a specific finding of misconduct, this is where most people get kind of like, I think they get a little confused, right? Because like, what is official misconduct? The problem seems to be that what I've seen is that the problem seems to be a lot of things that sheriffs do may or may not fall into the category of official misconduct. It's not always clear. There's kind of misconduct, like, recently there was, oh, like if a sheriff is arrested for a crime. Now, even that's not totally clear. A sheriff arrested for a crime does not necessarily have to resign, and they may or may not be removed, but sometimes it's that, if you guys remember in Kentucky, there was like a sheriff who shot a judge, right? That kind of thing is usually like very specifically like direct misconduct. Usually the sheriff just resigns, so like they don't have to deal with like handling the whole like process of removal. So that's why you see sheriffs resign, honestly. It's because the process of removal is, it's cumbersome. It's also expensive, right? Because if you are a sheriff defending yourself against some kind of recall or some kind of impeachment claim, there's usually a question about like whether the county is going to pay for that or not. And if the county isn't paying for it, then you have to pay for it yourself. So it's actually, that's like one of the big reasons. It also costs money for the county. County now has to like sort of put the bill and energy into like recalling the sheriff. It is very, very difficult. And getting signatures can be very difficult. A few people tried to remove their sheriffs during COVID. It was very difficult to get signatures. They have to be wet. It's like they have right, it has to be a wet signature, it has to be this way. Everything has like all these like procedural rules, which can make it a difficult hurdle. It's not like the olden days where like, everyone just like signed a paper with like a quill, like the measures kind of contemplate that like all the voters are hanging out in the town hall and they would just like sign it with a quill or whatever, and then you would remove the sheriff. But that's not really the world we live in. And so like these laws have just like not been, they've just not been updated for like kind of like more modern times. I will also say a lot of these rules for sheriffs were written when we didn't have mass incarceration. I think it's important to point out, like when sheriffs were created, and were created without a lot of thought. But to be clear, like we did not have, we did not have the criminal legal system we have now, which is like the number of people who are who are arrested and processed through jails, who go to prison, who get deported. There's so many more people in the system. The sheriff, when the position was created and this was contemplated, it wasn't necessarily contemplated that they would be that powerful, right, at the time that the procedures were created. So it's also a situation in which mass incarceration has sort of helped facilitate this office that's like, that's kind of outdated, the rules are kind of old, and like nobody thought that they would be, nobody thought that they would have jails with, thousands of people in them.
Related to the question of election of sheriffs, one of the proposals that's been tossed around in the state is to eliminate the requirement that a sheriff be a law enforcement officer with a certain number of years of experience as a sworn officer. And in particular, in light of the fact that they run these, in many cases, large correctional institutions with a charge to do things like rehabilitate folks that are convicted and reentry back into the community. Does it make sense to remove that requirement that to be sworn officers to run?
Yeah, so that was something that was being contemplated a few years ago. And here I'll just say that I don't think it went to, I don't remember where it ended in the process, but I was lined up to testify in favor of that bill. So I was like a person who was going to, anyway, so my position was that I supported that bill. It's a little interesting because California actually has more requirements for sheriff than almost every other state. It has like, you have to have both certification and you have to have worked, or you have to have some sort of educational requirement. Like it has like a pretty hefty requirement. And actually some states are trying to add requirements because they have none. So there's a handful of states with like no requirement. You could be anybody. And now they're trying to add requirements with the idea that you would get like more professional police. Now, of course, the problem is like the California example kind of shows that like adding the professional requirement has not necessarily like improved the quality of sheriff. Right. So it's sort of like one of those things where I would say, well, we haven't really seen an improvement in the quality of sheriffs by adding this professional requirement, so it's not clear what it's doing. What I do think it does, and the intent of it when it was enacted, right? I mean, it was enacted intentionally to like exclude potentially progressive sheriffs who just didn't come from law enforcement. It was a sort of it was a self-serving law that sheriffs wanted because they wanted their own guys in office and they didn't want people electing someone from the outside, right? So there was like the San Francisco sheriff who was not law enforcement. So they didn't want people electing kind of non-law enforcement insiders. So I do think that what the requirement tends to do in California is just produce, like, you have to sort of grow your sheriff in the office and then vote, right? It's hard for outsiders to get elected because of this requirement. It also makes it difficult to change the office substantially because if you elect someone with a different background, they might do things differently. I do think it probably also serves a sort of gatekeeping requirement for women and people of color because you have fewer women and people of color who are sworn deputies or sworn police. You're going to have fewer people who could come up the pipeline. And so I think that it's one of those things where you sort of like try to cut, like their obvious goal is to try to like reduce the population. I mean, kind of ironically, the other group of people that like getting rid of requirements are the far right, like constitutional sheriff movement also wants to get rid of also doesn't like requirements. So sometimes it's sort of a weird bedfellow thing. So there's a far right movement called the constitutional sheriffs. There are a few in California. They tend to be very far to the right, I would say, with a lot of far right views, but they also like don't think that they should be requirements for sheriff because they sort of have this like libertarian idea, like you can elect anybody for sheriff. Anyway, so it's sort of a weird like convergence.
Right. Yeah. As you know, California passed AB 1185 that authorized every county to set up a civilian oversight body or professionals for the sheriff's office. And yet sheriffs are elected officials. The oversight bodies have no authority over the sheriffs for that reason. What is your opinion about how we can realistically have effective oversight, civilian oversight of sheriffs in California?
So I think oversight is difficult. Now, I've thought a lot about this actually, because one of the things that inevitably came up in researching the book is that, quite frankly, like some of the places with oversight. So if you look at LA has had oversight of their sheriff for quite a long time, that it hasn't seemed to be as effective. I mean, it's not as effective as it could be. So like the question is, why isn't it as effective as it could be? I think there are very important guidelines for good oversight. So, to some of the issues with oversight that are kind of technical issues, like one is always access to like kind of I was going to call it secret. They don't call it secret in the sheriff's office, like sort of privileged material. So things like what's in personnel files, information that is non-public, right? So there's a lot of non-public information in sheriff's office, particularly relating to personnel. And that, there's often a question about whether civilian oversight can get access to that. That's something that they're not eager to do. The other issue tends to be, I mean, and all of you know that what tends to happen is law enforcement resists oversight. So they want to claim as much privilege as they can. So one is sort of this privilege problem of information. The second issue is this issue of, I think deputy unions serve a problem, right? Because if the oversight, and this again relates to personnel, the problem with oversight is like you could do the policies, like you could sit down and say like these are very good policies, but the root of getting the oversight to happen has to be that the deputies have to do the policies have to be put in action. So if you look at Los Angeles as an example, there are policies that outlaw deputy gangs, but they still have deputy gangs, right? Like the policy is you're not supposed to have them, but they still have them. And so the issue is, well, the people aren't following the policy, like they're not following the policy. So why are they following the policy? Well, one of the reasons is that the deputy union is resisting the policy, right? So they have someone that defends them on their behalf. And then two, they're claiming that like a lot of this information is privileged or protected by First Amendment, or, it's like information that the oversight committee shouldn't have. And, I do think also this relates to then the issue of if you want to question deputies. The second other challenge I think the Los Angeles civilian oversight has had is, like, quite frankly, asking questions and getting answers. Like, it's just a very difficult process. Like, you could subpoena them and they could come, but the problem has simply been that it is you cannot if even civilian oversight, if you are asking a deputy questions, they are entitled to protection, again, because of the union, right? They have particular union protections. And so you cannot like force people to like say things. And so because you cannot force people to say things, you cannot necessarily get the information that you need, right? So like, I do think that that's like the limits of oversight, is because, the sheriff's office has sort of tried to build, and most law enforcement has, they built themselves up like a layer of impenetrability. It's hard for civilian oversight to get through that, right? Because if you cannot ask, are you a member of, I would just keep using LA as an example. And so my apologies to people from Los Angeles. But if you keep asking, well, are you a member of a deputy gang, or do you have a deputy gang tattoo? And they say, I don't want to tell you, or I don't have to tell you, then you can't really get the question answered, right?
Mhm.
And so I think I think that just getting that information is like a huge challenge. And the notion of civilian oversight is something that law enforcement resists, right? Because they don't like the idea that people who aren't them are going to look at what they're doing and then tell them what they're doing is not working, right? Like that's the point. I mean, the point of oversight is to say this isn't working, but they don't like people kind of looking around and poking and saying, this is what you're doing, we don't think this is working. And so I do think it's like a huge challenge, because how do you change the culture of the department that has worked so hard to keep itself the way it is, right? I mean, that's how they've managed to that's how they maintain sort of power. And so I think it's extremely difficult. I see a question about the inspector general. So the problem I would add with the subpoena power is that while you can subpoena, you cannot force people to answer questions honestly. It's kind of you can make them come sometimes. Sometimes they'll come, but you can't make them, you sort of can't make them do it. It's really like, I mean, when you think about it, it's a little, I was gonna say it's a little bonkers, right? Because if you or I, Jerry, got called to court and they were like, Jerry, you have to answer these questions, like, did you do this? Did you that? We have to respond to the questions, right? If we don't answer the questions, the worst thing that might happen is we might go to jail. But what do you do when a deputy's not like, what do you do when they're not answering questions? Well, it's not the same. And so it is kind of, I mean, I do think it's sort of this like essential, like, it's sort of like an essential tautological problem with law enforcement, that like the reasons why law enforcement misbehaves, let's say the way it does, are the same things that make it like resistant to civilian oversight.
So this question is a little bit layered, so
Yeah.
I apologize in advance, but I think it's an important one about immigration and the role of sheriffs. That is something that you've been talking about lately. And as you note in your book, white supremacy has been a historical feature of policing by sheriffs, particularly sheriffs, and still affects how they tend to police to this day. And you have, more broadly, police agencies using pretext stops pretty regularly as a policing strategy. And you can see the racial disparities in that as that data has been revealed across the state of California. So I'm wondering, in this kind of context, how do you see the Lake and Riley Act that Congress just passed, which has made more lower level criminal offenses a basis to deport folks, and with the sheriff's offices more inclined to do that policing for the in cooperation with ICE? How do you see all of this playing out together, I guess, is the question.
No, it's a very complicated question, and this is one where things are changing.
Yeah.
And it's okay because we have, as you point out, we have layers. We have federal law, and then you have state law. So California law, right, which will regulate California sheriffs, and then you have what the sheriffs decide they are going to do, right? Quite frankly, now the Lake and Riley Act. What's really important about the Lake and Riley Act, in my view, is that it does not put any obligation, nor can it require local law enforcement to do anything. Now, so there is a legal doctrine, it's called non-commandeering, and the rule is the federal government can't make sheriffs do anything. And if this sounds like something that the constitutional sheriff movement supports, and that's because it does, right? That's their route, right? They get to decide. So sheriffs can decide if they want to cooperate with ICE, but you cannot force them to. So in theory, one of the kind of one of the issues with the Lake and Riley Act that I do not at this point know how they're going to solve it is that the Lake and Riley Act purports to say if you arrest any, and this seems to be what they're doing, if you arrest anybody pretty much for anything, and you have reason to think that they might be deportable, you have to call ICE, and ICE will come and get them, and then ICE will detain them. So that's what the Lake and Riley Act contemplates, is that ICE will come pick these people up and ICE will detain them. Now, that's more complicated than it sounds because there are places where sheriffs lease jail space to ICE, and so they might be there. Now, nowhere in California can do that right now. So right now, California does not let sheriffs lease their jail space, but of course you have you have the Geo facility and San Bernardino. I mean, like there are like private immigration detention facilities in California, even though the sheriffs aren't holding these people in their jail. Now, the second issue is the problem of when, and this has come up a lot lately. This seems to be something that again, it's still being worked out between the federal government and local cooperation. What the federal government and Tom Homan want is they want to be able to basically ask sheriffs kind of to act as arms of ICE in their ideal world. They want to say, well, if you arrest someone who might be deportable, you have to arrest them, you have to call us, and you probably have to hold them for us, which is it's called a detainer. So honoring a detainer. Now, California technically does not let sheriffs hold people for ICE either. So this is like another state where you have state law that says you can't hold people. It's usually about a 2-day hold is the most common one. So in some states, like in North Carolina, where I live, now there's new states. So some states have laws that say you must honor detainers, like Texas, North Carolina now, Florida. More states are passing these, which basically say if you get an ask from ICE to hold someone, you must hold them. Now, if ICE doesn't pick that person up in 2 or 3 days, they're supposed to release them because you cannot just like detain people indefinitely, in theory. Again, it's all like in theory, you can't do that. What the Trump administration wants to contemplate is that they would just kind of have everybody arresting and detaining, like a consistent, right, arresting and detaining. Now, again, because of the interaction of like state and federal laws, it's kind of imperfect. I think that what's interesting in California, now what they tend to do in California is arrest data is public. So when someone is arrested, you can look it up. You guys probably didn't know that. You can look it up on the website. ICE can do that too. So what ICE does is just look up who's being arrested in California on the website and then goes and picks that person up, usually when they're released. So they drive a van and they're like, such and so's getting out, and then they'll go pick those people up. And we know that like a couple thousand people, like during the Biden administration, a couple thousand people were deported in this way. Like people are deported this way. Now, I think there's a question about right now in California about how many sheriffs will defy the state law. A few sheriffs, especially in Southern California, have already said that they're perfectly happy to cooperate with ICE, and they think they don't like the California law. Some of them have said they think the California law has more wiggle room than some other people think it does, right? So like you could sort of see right now, like all the sheriffs sort of scrambling to kind of say like, well, we got to comply with like all the laws, but maybe this law is not as vigorous as that law, and maybe we could do like this XYZ. Oh, someone just asked, sheriffs aren't allowed to share release dates with ICE. Technically, in California, no. In other states, yes, they call them. So for that, sorry for that question, Caroline. So in other states, if someone is being released who is potentially deportable, they can call ICE and say, hey, we have this person, do you want to pick, or whatever. They notify them. Now, a lot of times, to be clear, those people don't get picked up. This is like a huge thing. Like ICE does not have the manpower to pick all these people up, which is why the sanctuary, these sort of so-called sanctuary city laws have some impact, because you're forcing ICE to do more work.
But if their data is through the biometrics and ICE looks at it and they know that they're in jail because they see the biometrics entered,
Yes.
then if ICE calls the sheriff's office, most sheriff's offices in California will let them pick them up at the jail. So they're not.
No,
They do. They
mostly
yeah.
do. They just drive. Yeah, they drive the van up, and then they walk out, and then they walk into the van. So it's like technically not using a state resource, but the van is like on the street. Yes, so that's what they do. They drive the
At
van
the
up.
Sallyport. Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
yeah.
now the problem, of course, with all of this, and I think what you were also getting at, is that all of this obviously just relies on from what I could see, it all relies on a great deal of racial profiling. Yes, it is. I mean, it is plainly all about like what language people speak, what their surname is, and what they look like. So absolutely, yes, this is all like that is what they're doing. They will say they're not, but that they plainly are. I mean, they are racist, because that's how else do you determine? You know, how else do you look at a list of people and say these people must be deportable? So it doesn't make it.
So we're reaching the end of our time, but before we get there, I wanted to actually say, you know, this is a difficult political environment for folks that are pointing out injustices and authoritarian features of the criminal justice system. So just on a personal note, first off, thank you for the work you do, but have you experienced any of that kind of pushback or you know, personal attacks online or anywhere else that has given you concern in doing this work? And I'd just like to give you an opportunity to talk about that.
Oh, well, so yes, to some extent. Honestly, it kind of depends on the situation. So in a few instances, a lot of it actually was not immediately when the book came out, but I do agree that since the election, there's a lot more people that feel a lot more empowered to just say whatever, you know. And I mean, look, you know, a white woman, and I don't get as much, you know, when I was reporting the book, like sometimes people ask me about like the process of reporting. I did not find the process of reporting that, I mean, look, I don't like it when people say ugly things, or like as a person, I don't like when people say ugly things, or I don't like racist things and that sort of thing. And I don't like violence, but like towards me, it was not like a huge thing. I do think since the election, like more people are feeling just like more enabled to say whatever. And so I get like a little more like people saying whatever. And there's, you know, depending on what's going on, sheriffs are feeling very defensive of their, you know, right to, mostly right now, again, their right to participate in mass deportation. I will flag like a few other things like that are going on, which is one is going to be like the arrest of houseless people because of the, again, change in law, right? You've had a change in law. Now there's going to be different arrests, and you have the rollback in California of the you have Prop 36. So that's another, like you have all these things that are kind of like empowering sheriffs to like do more arrests. So like I wanted to flag those quickly as like things that are kind of giving them more like energy to do different things. So I mean, I'm okay, don't worry. I've been okay, but every once in a while there's some people out there.
Yes, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this information and the knowledge that you have. And it's been very valuable, and we certainly appreciate it.
Yes, and I apologize. So many people had questions I didn't get to.
Yeah.
You shared my Substack. I'm on social media, mostly Blue Sky as Jess Pish. You can look me up on social media or try, feel free to contact me if there's something I didn't. I apologize, I couldn't get to everything. There's too much. And on social media, I'm trying to mostly I've been focusing quite a lot on immigration because that's what's going on, and trying to update exactly what's going on. So I wish everyone well, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was so powerful and helpful, and we wish we had longer. And thank you so much, Jerry. So I'm Nancy Goodban with FxSN, and I just had a call to action. So now that you've heard what Jessica said, if you're not already involved in oversight, first find out if there's someone in your county that's already working on it and reach out to them. Make public comment to your board of supervisors if you're concerned about jail conditions or deaths in the jail or racial profiling, because even though sheriffs don't have any direct accountability and the board and nobody can tell them what to do, basically they think that they're above the law, but public pressure and transparency, which is what oversight provides, is kind of the solution. I mean, member cities have police departments, as she said, that are police chiefs are appointed by the city council, and so they can be fired, whereas sheriffs are elected and there's no way to really get rid of them. And to find out more, and we'll put the link in the chat, but email the California Coalition for Sheriff Oversight and find out more, or join us. And people who are in San Mateo County, look at our website, FxSMC.org, and sign up for our events. Come to our happy hour, which is February 18th. Come to our Measure A forum, which is also February 18th. So thank you, everybody, for coming.